We live in a world where billionaires can fly into space for fun, while millions of people cannot afford basic healthcare, food, or education. The gap between rich and poor feels enormous, and sometimes it feels new, like a side effect of globalization or technology. But inequality is not new. The truth is that wealth disparity is as old as civilization itself. From the first farmers to modern tech giants, wealth has always concentrated in the hands of a few. To understand today's crisis, we need to go back. We need to trace how inequality began, how it evolved, and why it keeps coming back in new forms. The genesis of inequality, seeds sown in ancient civilizations. For most of human history, there was no billionaire class. No landlords, no kings. Humans lived in small hunter-gatherer groups, moving from place to place in search of food. Life was hard. People often died young, but in many ways, it was equal. Why? Because in a world where survival depended on daily hunting and foraging, no one could hoard massive resources. If you killed a deer, you shared it. If you found fruit, you distributed it. There were leaders, yes, but they were not owners of wealth. This balance ended with the agricultural revolution. Around 10,000 years ago, humans began to farm in fertile regions like Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley in Egypt. Farming changed everything. Suddenly, food could be stored. Land became the most valuable resource. And once land became property, inequality was born. In Mesopotamia, the invention of irrigation systems meant whoever controlled the water controlled life itself. In Egypt, pharaohs and elites built enormous wealth by taxing grain harvests, while ordinary farmers worked the fields with little chance of ever escaping their station. Land ownership created a permanent divide, the haves and the have-nots. But inequality wasn't just about farming, it was about conquest. Take the Roman Empire. Rome's expansion was not simply about spreading culture or governance. It was about tribute. Conquered lands paid taxes, sent slaves, and supplied resources that enriched Roman elites. Wealth was extracted upward, leaving local populations dependent and poor. The empire's roads and armies may have spread civilization, but they also hardened class divisions. Debt played its part too. Ancient financial instruments may look primitive to us, but their effects were powerful. In Babylon, clay tablets record loans made in silver or grain, often with crushing interest rates. Families who fell behind on payments lost their land, their freedom, even their children to debt slavery. Meanwhile, wealthy creditors expanded their estates. Inequality was no longer just about conquest, it was embedded in financial systems. By the time we move past the ancient world, the blueprint of inequality is set. Land ownership, conquest, and debt, three forces that would shape human societies for thousands of years. Feudalism to colonialism, entrenching disparity. When the Roman Empire fell, inequality didn't disappear. It simply changed shape. In medieval Europe, power was no longer held by emperors, but by kings, lords, and nobles. The system we call feudalism was built on a simple idea: land is power. Kings granted land to nobles, nobles gave land to knights, and peasants worked the land. Everyone had a place, and that place was almost impossible to escape. If you were born a peasant in the 12th century, you would almost certainly die a peasant. You worked long hours in fields you did not own, giving a share of your harvest to the local lord. The nobles collected rents, while you struggled to survive winter after winter. Social mobility was close to zero. The son of a blacksmith became a blacksmith. The daughter of a peasant became a peasant's wife. Wealth was inherited, and privilege was passed down like blood. In this way, inequality was not just economic, it was cultural, legal, and even religious. The church often reinforced the idea that this hierarchy was natural, even divinely ordained. To challenge the order was to challenge God. But Europe wasn't alone. Similar systems of hereditary privilege existed in Japan with the samurai, in India with caste divisions, and in China with imperial bureaucracies where landowners and scholar officials lived far above the peasants. The age of exploration wealth on a global scale. By the 15th and 16th centuries, a new chapter of inequality opened, the age of exploration. European nations Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, the Netherlands set sail across the oceans in search of new lands, new trade routes, and above all, new wealth. What followed reshaped the world and created inequalities that still haunt us today. The most brutal example was the transatlantic slave trade. Over the course of 400 years, an estimated 12 million Africans were kidnapped, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic. They worked in sugar plantations in the Caribbean, cotton fields in the American South, and mines in South America. The profits were enormous for European traders, plantation owners, and investors. But for the enslaved, it meant generations of suffering, trauma, and dispossession. Colonialism was not just about slavery. It was also about resource extraction. The Spanish Empire took mountains of silver from Bolivia and Mexico, fueling Europe's rise. Britain extracted wealth from India through trade monopolies and heavy taxation, devastating local economies. The Dutch controlled spice routes in Asia with military force, enriching Amsterdam while leaving colonies impoverished. This was not free trade. This was plunder. Colonies became suppliers of cheap raw materials, while Europe industrialized, manufactured goods, and sold them back at a profit. The economic gap between Europe and much of the rest of the world widened dramatically. Mercantilism, a rigged game. At the heart of this global expansion was a system called mercantilism. Governments gave companies like the British East India Company or the Dutch VOC the power to act like states. They could wage war, sign treaties, and even raise armies. These corporations held monopolies over trade, crushing local competition. For European elites, this was a golden age of profit. For colonized peoples, it was a catastrophe. Their resources were extracted, their labor exploited, their lands reorganized for the benefit of distant rulers. Inequality was no longer local, or regionally had become global. By the 18th century, Europe was rich not only because of its own productivity, but because it had systematically drained wealth from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The world economy was now tilted in favor of a few powers and their elites. And that tilt has never fully disappeared. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. The Industrial Revolution was not just a period of invention, it was a revolution in how humans lived, worked, and divided wealth. It began in Britain in the late 18th century and soon spread across Europe and America. At its heart were machines spinning jennies, steam engines, textile looms, railways, and coal-powered factories. For ordinary people, this meant leaving villages and farms and moving into crowded cities. Families who once worked their own land now worked in factories owned by others. Men, women, even children spent 12 or 14 hours a day operating machines, often in unsafe conditions. The pay was barely enough to survive. Meanwhile, the factory owners became immensely wealthy. A single industrialist could own mills that produced cloth for half the world, employing thousands of workers, yet keeping most of the profits for himself. This was a new kind of inequality, not based on land or titles, but on capital ownership. Those who owned the machines and the factories controlled the future. Urbanization and the new working class. Cities like Manchester, London, and New York grew at explosive rates. Streets filled with smoke, sewage, and disease. Workers lived in cramped apartments or slums, sometimes 10 people to a single room. But for the wealthy, urbanization meant new mansions, theaters, and political influence. This divide created a new class system. On one side stood the industrial working class, the laborers who sold their time for survival. On the other side were the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, merchants, and bankers whose wealth grew faster than any aristocrat's estate. Karl Marx, living in 19th century London, saw this divide and famously predicted that it would lead to revolution. Workers, he argued, would eventually rise up against the capitalist system. And while revolutions did erupt from Paris in 1848 to Russia in 1917, capitalism itself proved more adaptable than Marx expected. Part of the reason inequality grew so extreme during this period was the dominance of laissez-faire economics. The idea was simple: let markets run freely. Governments should not interfere with business. No strict regulations, no heavy taxes on the rich, no safety rules for workers. The result? Enormous fortunes for industrialists and financiers, alongside brutal conditions for the working poor. In the United States, tycoons like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan became some of the richest men in history. Their companies controlled steel, oil, and banking. Their wealth was so vast that they were called the robber barons. At the same time, immigrants and poor workers in cities like New York or Chicago lived in overcrowded tenements, often lacking clean water or sanitation. Children worked in coal mines. Women labored in textile mills for pennies. Inequality was not hidden. It was visible on every city street.